The Empathy Table is an Ideos podcast. We believe empathy can shape and influence the ideas for solving some of our world's greatest challenges. Both ideas and empathy begin with a story, and stories are often shared around a table. Pull up a chair. Welcome to the table. I'm honored to be joined today by Asma Uddin and Travis Wussow in a conversation about religious pluralism and how vulnerability and empathy will help us build a future that protects the religious freedom of people from every faith community. We hope you'll enjoy this episode. Joining us today on the Empathy Table, we have Asma Uddin. Asma is the author of When Islam is Not a Religion, Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom, and an Inclusive America Project Fellow at the Aspen Institute, where she is leading a project on peace building in the U.S. culture war. Hi, Asma.
Hi, Alyssa.
It's good to have you with us today.
Good to be here.
And next we have Travis Wussow. Travis is the Vice President for Public Policy and General Counsel for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. Mr. Wussow launched ERLC's first international office located in the Middle East. Hi, Travis.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great.
So good to have you both here. So just to get started off, I'd love to hear from both of you how you've been doing in the COVID-19 era, what life looks like for you right now.
Well, life, I think, for me, looks a lot like, I think, a lot of Americans, at least those of us who are fortunate to be able to work from home and to continue to be productive and to earn. So there's the gratefulness that I had for that, to be able to continue my work. There's definitely an upside to being in a lockdown, which is you're sort of forced to stay at your desk and write, which for those of us who travel a lot is actually a blessing. But of course, having everyone in the house has been a little crazy. And so I think I'm just sort of in the same boat as everyone else who has young children who are just increasingly becoming restless.
Yeah, I can echo that. We have two small girls, first and third grade. My wife also works, and so it's just been it's been I think Asma put it well. I mean, we're fortunate to be able to do our work from home. We're fortunate that our my organization and my wife's business haven't have enabled us to continue to put food on the table. Not everybody's that lucky, but these are times that are demanding a lot from us. I feel more exhausted at the end of the week than I normally do. I think everybody feels the same. I also feel just an immense gratitude for our kids' teachers. I mean, they have a tough job, so I'm grateful for the way that they've stepped up to the plate during this time to help our kids learn.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very unique time. It's good to hear that you're both faring well, though. Can you tell us more about what you do and what brings you to the Empathy Table today?
Sure. Well, I'll let Travis start on this one.
Yeah, sure. So my organization is basically the public policy and ethics organization for the Southern Baptist Convention. The SBC is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. And our work as an organization is, kind of falls on two tracks. One is equipping our churches, speaking to our churches, helping them make sense of the big questions of the day, of which, the coronavirus is and its impact on our culture and churches and society is certainly one of those questions. And then the other track of our work is really the work that I lead for our organization, and that is speaking on behalf of Southern Baptists in Washington, D.C. So I'm actually not in D.C. now. I've been in Texas for the last couple of months, where I'm from. I'm actually in my brother's childhood bedroom right now, but D.C. is home for us, and that's where we carry out our work, representing the issues that Southern Baptists care about. What brings me to this conversation and into this table, is in part, my own personal interest in working with people who aren't like me and who don't share my beliefs, but but nonetheless trying to find common cause and a way for us to work together. But of course, my boss, Russell Moore, really shares and leads the way on that for our organization. So that's what brings me to this conversation.
So I'm a bit of a freelancer these days, working on projects at a number of places, but mostly at the Asma Institute in Washington, D.C., where I'm a fellow with the Inclusive America Project. And that fellowship came out of, I would say, probably the publication of my first book, which is called When Islam is Not a Religion, Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom, and the then sort of director of the Justice and Society program, in which the Inclusive America Project is housed at the Asma Institute, was one of the people who endorsed the book, and she really felt strongly about my message there. And she actually sent me an email when I started thinking about next steps in terms of implementing it, saying, "What do you think about housing this at Aspen?" And I said, "Of course." And being there and having been there for a while now, I do think that fit is the right fit. And my work there and this idea, that sort of next stage of engagement, which sort of is at the intersection of Muslims and conservative Christians, and also the right and the left, the political right and left, kind of just came about unintentionally. It was, I went to law school. I was a lawyer. I, for a long time, worked at the Beckett Fund, which is a nonprofit law firm in Washington, D.C., that works on religious liberty cases across the political spectrum. And then after that, kind of, dabbled in some other things. But it was just sort of my sort of existence as an American Muslim, but also being in a place where I was working on cases that have increasingly been the cause of a lot of political division. It just gave me interesting, just insights that I think are unique. And I just, I saw people on the ground and what they were experiencing and feeling and saying. And then I saw what the media and politicians were saying about these people. And I'm like, there's this huge gap in between, what I was observing and what I was reading. And I was like, well, if anything, if it's like my own personal experience as being part of the Muslim community and having to deal with horrible sort of mischaracterizations of my own community, it's, it almost sort of makes it a requirement upon me to be able to step up and be like, well, I think there's very sort of fundamental misconceptions here about, for example, conservative Christians. And so I think I was put in this place of just having that insight for a reason. And I think one of the most sort of interesting and also pressing issues of our time right now is this huge divide, this religious polarization. And my job is really, I think, to help bring some peace there. And so I think it's exactly about what the Empathy Roundtable is all about, right? It's about saying we don't need to be constantly fighting. Maybe we can see each other as humans, which is the first step to empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you both for the work that you do. So this episode is about faith, and I'd love to hear from both of you how your faith has informed your work and just what your faith background is and how that has been a part of your life. And Asma, if you could kick us off with that question.
Yeah, I mean, I actually write about this in my first book. I talk a lot about my father and how he represented for me both sort of what it means to be truly sort of invested in your faith, inspired by your faith, sort of have a certainty of God's presence in your life, what that means in terms of your actions and your character. And also just his role as somebody who made major contributions to so many different facets of his community as an immigrant to the US, what that meant specifically in relation to being an American. And so that to me is, I think, a perfect example. It's just that having grown up with that example, it was cultivated within me quite early on, the sense of certainty that God does exist and that he does play an active role in our life. And that's always been something like the Quran talks about God communicating with us through signs, right? Like things that, you see in nature. The Quran talks a lot about that. But I definitely felt that when I was talking with God that I saw things where you can tell that he's responding. And so I've always carried that certainty with me throughout my life. And I think just that sort of reaffirmation about what it means to be Muslim and the fact that, it is ultimately about compassion, empathy, and contributing to your society that's how I would say my faith has motivated me.
Well, for me, I did grow up going to church, but I didn't have that sort of early lifelong certainty that Asma talks about, and my journey to becoming a Christian really happened my first year of college through what was a ministry to the homeless in Dallas and the homeless in Austin, and it was really through, I mean, it's a long story and I won't take the time to share it all here, but the reason I mention it is the reason I mention that detail is that my journey to God really came through seeing the way that he works in and cares about the vulnerable and cares about those who are invisible to the rest of us, and so I think that it's really impacted and that insight I think has really influenced a lot of my life, and I think in some ways influenced why I wanted to why I was interested in working with Russell more, because he his part of a huge part of his ministry is really that same impulse, helping and illuminate the invisible. And so that's ultimately what brought me to ERLC. I mean, I work for a religious organization, so what I do is inherently and fundamentally faith-based, and the way that we sort of talk about our work in Christian terms is applying the theology of the kingdom of God as Jesus taught to the way that we live out the Christian life. What are the implications of the fact that we are citizens of another kingdom on the way that we live, the way that we worship God, the way that we love our neighbors, the way that we live our lives together as Christians. And so I mean, what I feel so fortunate. I started out my career as an energy lawyer in Austin, and it was good work. It was important work. I learned a ton. Doing it. But I feel really lucky to get to align both my vocation or to align my vocation with the things that I believe in and hold most dearly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to hear both of your backgrounds being fairly different, but then having a common thread of impacting the way that you interact with the world and sort of your vocational work, but also your participation in the civic dialogue. Can you tell me more about how your faith shapes your interaction with that sphere?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think so you mentioned kind of earlier in my bio, I lived in the Middle East. I lived in Jerusalem for a couple of years, and we lived in one of those seam neighborhoods in Jerusalem that was no man's land before the 1967 war. So if I turned right at the end of my street, it was Arabic was being spoken. If I turned left, it was Hebrew. And that time in my life really, I think really, before that, I'd been living in Austin, Texas, which has sort of a reputation of being this sort of interesting, diverse place. The reality is, it's Texas. It's pretty homogenous, and so I think being confronted with people who believed just as deeply as I do the things that they believe in Jerusalem every day. I was as an evangelical Christian was absolutely the minority. There were, on some days it felt like there were just a handful of us in Jerusalem. But that, it really impacted, that experience impacted the way that, certainly I looked at people who believe things strongly, but believe different things from me. But I think in some ways it sort of drew me into that, those conversations. I just found it, and still do find it to be, interesting to see how somebody's beliefs shape their, the way that they interact with the world, and find ways that converges with, my own ethic, and the ways that it diverges from that. And so, I think, this sort of conversation around empathy and understanding, understanding others is crucial, not just because I think it's good for our communities and good for the world, which I do, but I think it's also good for me. It's good for all of us. I understand myself as a Christian better because I understand how I'm different from other people, which I think is a real gift that these kinds of conversations can give us.
I think for me, my current context for it is our current state of polarization, whether it be in this country or internationally. And certain facets of it that I just find to be so peculiar, I guess, coming at it from a religious perspective. One, that there's like so much certainty that people have about their position being right? And which then leads to this hesitation to explore the other side, because if you're always right, then what's the point of having to consider the other side, right? And of course, then the second part of that, which is not only is the other side fundamentally and absolutely wrong, but is also apparently evil and not even worthy of engagement, right? So the more I think we've gotten to these extreme stages in this polarization, the more to me, I'm just like, well, why? I've been able to resist that. And a part of me just thinks, well, why? And I think there's different life experiences that have led to that. But I think it's also just the fact that as a religious person, and then generally I find that in religious contexts, and I'm not necessarily saying just Muslim contexts, but in contexts in which you're engaging with other traditional or other devout believers, I see a lesser tendency toward this. And I think part of it is because there's this external referent, right? It's like God, and the fact that he's actually the only one who has absolute sort of knowledge and truth, and that we're just sort of trying to find our way to it, and of course are fallible in that search. And just sort of putting that source outside of yourself as the truth that does not reside within you in that sort of absolute way, I think just does a lot for open-mindedness and for an ability, I think, to be able to rise above the political fray and understand that reality is probably a lot more complicated than a lot of people make it out to be.
Yeah, you're so right. And that both of your perspectives are so helpful to me as I'm just recently graduated from college and stepping out into the world as an adult for the first time, and trying to figure out how to navigate all that polarization and really the hatred that's just going around. And in this series, I think we're talking about how we navigate through all of these realities and through these tensions, especially in light of COVID-19. I think all the tensions that were already underlying are just coming up to the surface in some really, really ugly ways. But how have your faith communities weathered the COVID-19 pandemic? And are there ways that your communities are responding, and anything unique in those responses as a result of your faith traditions?
Well, I think that you're right about what you were saying in terms of the usual polarization sort of resurfacing. And that was a question for me in the beginning of this lockdown. When coronavirus was such a new thing still, I wondered. I was just like, well, where is this going to take our society? Or is it that because we're suffering in such a mutual way? I mean, it's really sort of profound, the sort of the universal sort of experience of it. Like, people all across the world people are so different from us, are going through exactly what we're going through. And of course in the US as well. And there was a moment there where I thought there was a possibility that there would just be this opening for empathy. And I'm hoping that opening still is. But of course, in due time, the same sort of polarized conflict just came up all over again, just sort of like the COVID version of it. Whether it be the fight over wearing masks, about the shutdown, which businesses should be shut down. And then, of course, the very sort of particular religious conflict that has come up in terms of churches challenging the closure of churches and houses of worship. I think that's been interesting. In terms of the Muslim community, from the get-go, I've seen just an outpouring of empathy and a desire to serve the vulnerable, whether it be our religious leaders, working to put in places services and raise funds for people who were impacted by this financially. Hundreds of thousands of dollars raised within, immediately within the first couple of weeks, whether it be religious leaders stepping up to serve, to fill the spiritual void, whether it be, individual innovators in the community developing, like one of my friends developed an app, pretty much within the first couple of weeks of the shutdown to connect vulnerable people who couldn't go out to get things they need and people who are looking to help vulnerable people. And he just came up with this app where he was like, to connect those two sets of people, those sorts of things. And so whether it be financial, whether it be actual sort of service oriented, or whether it be the very sort of, vital function of serving the spiritual part of it, I think, I've seen the Muslim community step up in every way. Also you haven't really seen any challenges by mosques, for example, against the shutdown orders. And there's probably various complicated reasons for that. And then, of course, with, Ramadan just came to a close a couple of days ago, and that was interesting. Just the fact that Ramadan is a uniquely, super communal time of the year for us, right? Like if it's communal, there's elements of community, of course, throughout the year, but Ramadan is a time of the year where everybody breaks their fast together. The mosques are serving dinner every night. There's the communal prayer that happens late at night, in which the imam reads different parts of the Quran, so that you actually finish the Quran by the end of the 30 days. And then, of course, the Eid holiday, which is our equivalent of Christmas. I mean, that's the big holiday. And to experience all that in isolation, I think was a challenge for a lot of people. But again, I saw the community stepping up and doing things that were really creative, like a drive-through Eid celebration. So at least the kids had something fun and exciting, even if they had to kind of watch it from their car. And I think that's just been really kind of cool to watch. And so I think, maybe because we were the first to have to go through a major holiday. I know that Easter and Passover passed as well, but I would put Eid in the same level of celebration as probably Christmas. And I'd be curious, I'm really curious, honestly, to see how the Christian community celebrates Christmas, if this lockdown is still in place at that time.
Yeah, I would say for our community, Baptists tend to be great in crisis. Where in Texas, where I'm from, Texas and Louisiana, the Baptist churches rally, anytime a hurricane lands in the Gulf of Mexico, and our churches really rally around those moments. And so, to some extent, we have that muscle that certainly I've seen exercised in a 1,000 different ways in churches all across the country, whether that's from benevolence funds basically overflowing, people stepping up to support each other's businesses, to help families in need, but it's not even it's not just limited, I think, to our own communities. I mean, there's lots of stories of serving first responders, trying to acquire PPE and the other things that first responders need. What my own church in Washington has been doing is linking up with a church in Columbia Heights, which is a predominantly Latino community, to help with just basic everyday needs, because a lot of the federal stimulus left out the undocumented community for a variety of reasons. But our church and a few other churches sort of stepped into that space. And so I think there are a lot of stories like that that are I think important, not just because they're good in and of themselves, but also because they help pull us kind of out of our own suffering and grief, which is real, to see the bigger picture. Within our communities, I would say on a more spiritual front, what we've seen honestly is every pastor I've talked to about their live stream numbers, have said they basically don't make sense because they're so high. So many people are engaging with their communities that it sort of like I think speaks to this this deeper need that we all have to make sense of and to sort of try to derive meaning from this time. I was just thinking about how how difficult it would be to be a recent college graduate in these moments, trying to make sense of everything that's going on. Not just in an abstract sense, but the plans that you've made, the things that you've been working for, the job opportunities that have dried up, all of those things, those trigger big existential questions, and we have to grapple with those. Asma's right. I mean, we Easter fell in the middle of this. It was. I would say within my sort of corner of evangelicalism. I mean, Christmas obviously is really important, just culturally and because of tradition and all of that. But Easter is really the most important day of the year for us, and it was terrible, to have to celebrate it apart, and all of the sort of traditions that you and not even that, just sort of the liturgies that you build around your family and you build around your daily life to help sort of direct you into this crescendo of the church calendar. Is very difficult. I still am sort of feeling a sense of loss and a sense of disorientation in terms of just the year, because we didn't have that. So, and I think, as Asma sort of alluded, it will be interesting to see what Christmas ends up looking like if the virus dies down, or if there's a resurgence. To lose a whole year of these really important religious holidays, it will impact us. And I think pastors and spiritual leaders are trying to think about how do we make up for that? How do we continue to direct people to those transcendent things? Because I think God uses these moments to remind us of what's true, and to remind us of Himself and what He's done for us and what He is doing for us. And so, to lose those markers, I think is something significant that we need to figure out how to overcome.
Well, I would say one thing, like, I think for Eid, like, I felt it more because Eid is like, especially in our family, like, and some of our friends, they really kind of go all out. And so we have, one friend who throws like this amazing party every year, and it was so bad to have to like miss that, for that not to even happen. But with Ramadan was interesting. I definitely missed like the iftar dinners, like, because those were so much fun. I mean, you can't imagine the feeling of like when you haven't eaten all day, especially when it's during the summer. And then like that mutual joy at night when you get to eat together, and everyone competes to have like the best dinner that they cater or they cook. And so that was sad. But I would have to say that, like, I think there was like a lot of, talking to my other friends, there seemed to be an agreement that there was something really special about this Ramadan in terms of just our ability to engage in worship. Like, we spent the time and energy that we would have otherwise spent, going to these various dinners and commuting back and forth from the mosque, all that was extra time and energy to put into the worship itself. And so, and I definitely felt that. I felt like I accomplished a lot more on that front this Ramadan than in the past. And so, again, especially as a parent of young children, so you have that sort of like overlay of exhaustion on top of everything else. And so I think that's the upside. I think that there's like this element of spirituality that really kind of in our respective faiths that show us that even in moments of isolation and moments where we're undergoing trials, that there's like these openings and these sort of the silver linings, perhaps the ability to come closer to God. And I think I definitely experienced that part of it as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear. I mean, because I'm from obviously a Christian background, and so I wasn't even considering how other religions would be dealing with this, but I think there's this communal grief of we're missing the things that orient our week. For me, like I know what day it was based on when I go to church, or, you know, like that schedule kind of anchored me and gave me a sense of like tethering to the rest of my schedule. And without that there, it was just, it's disorienting. And I think absolutely worth grieving. But it's also interesting to hear you both kind of talk about some other like unexpected little joys and things popping up, things like generosity. So can you both comment more on how grief has played a part in this time, and then how that has maybe turned into some unexpected goodness that's come from this pandemic?
Yeah, I can start. There was this really great Harvard Business Review article that circulated kind of at the beginning of all of this. The title of it was that feeling that you're feeling is grief, and sort of worked through the stages of grief. And I've thought about that that article in some cases every day, but certainly every week as I'm trying to just make sense of what I'm I don't want this to sound too mystical, but like what I'm feeling, and how there's the sort of daily sadness of being apart from people that I really care about, and not getting to see my coworkers, not getting to see my neighbors, not getting to to be around the people that built my life around. With that being said, I mean, I think it's made, I think we probably all have a love-hate relationship with Zoom. I, just like anybody else, can only take it so many hours a day, but I think, I was having like a, Zoom coffee with a dear friend of mine a couple of weeks ago. And I think, we were both exhausted, but I think in some ways the distance made that interaction even more precious. One of the things that my church is doing right now is every morning, we gather and read a psalm together, and talk about what it means, and spend some time together in prayer. And so again, I mean, it's hard that we're we're apart, but in some ways those moments that we have been able to share are that much more precious, I think, because of the the loneliness that we're all feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've processed it yet as grief. I mean, I think there's definitely been moments where I feel something akin to grieving, where it's just like, especially because of the uncertainty. You don't really know when the world is going to come back to normal. If somebody's going to say, at the end of June, everything resumes, then I think that there's a level of patience that many people have that could, make it to the end of June. But I think the uncertainty of it and the fear of the unknown, in terms of what our world's going to look like, what our daily life is going to look like for the next, for the foreseeable future, I think that's what's really kind of causing, some degree of grieving and anxiety. As a parent, I would say, like, and I think that this is, it was interesting to me because prior to the lockdown, I was doing so much traveling, and I remember so many points on those various trips just being like, I'm ready to be home with my kids, and a part of me was like, I just felt like time was flying, and I felt like, my youngest, who turned 3 in the midst of this lockdown, I just felt like his life was just kind of going by, and I was missing it. And so what I've noticed with the lockdown is I just like, yes, the weeks do still seem to be going kind of fast, but I still like recognize each day. Like, it just seems like, there's times when I sit there, I have this book manuscript that's due in October, and sometimes I start to freak out. Like, I feel like I'm in the middle of summer. I'm like, wait, and, it's May, and I've been feeling this since like March, and I'm just like, I have to actually remind myself first, like, which month it is and which day it is. But the sense of like, life is just going at a sort of more steady kind of like, at a pace where I'm taking it in a lot more than I think I did before. And, I don't know if that's in any way sort of intrinsically connected to my faith, but it's just been like one of the sort of like more sort of profound realizations, and one of the things I'm grateful for.
Yeah, absolutely. Time is definitely taking a different, it just feels different. I think no matter how if you're experiencing that positively or negatively, it's just different.
Say it was an interesting phenomenon during Ramadan because you have like this schedule that you're already on with that, right? Because you can't eat till sundown. So sunset means everything. You become very, very aware of the precise minute on which it's sunset. And also it begins with dawn. So you also are very aware of that. And so when that's like overlaid onto this sort of like the monotony of, or sort of, I don't know whatever this is, of the slow motion experience of life in the lockdown, I think that was just, for me, it was just really kind of like a startling realization of time.
So we are talking about a multi-faith approach to COVID-19, and given both of your backgrounds, what are ways that you're seeing that we can come out of this better, relating to people who are different from us, who share different points of views, who share different religions? What are ways that we can relate to them better, and come out of this individually and as a society to ensure that we're better equipped to work together across these differences in the future?
I would, just to jump in, I would say, one of the silver linings of this time is that it is a universally shared suffering that we're all going through. Everybody has lost something. Some have lost, lost more, have lost loved ones, or lost jobs. But, even those of us who are lucky that, for me, my friends who have gotten COVID have recovered, for the most part. Our economic situation is stable. But, as we've been talking about through this conversation, we've all lost something. And that has a way of bringing people together across great difference. This will be, these months will be, a defining thing that's happened to all of us, and something that we can share and relate to, and just, on a basic level, build a conversation around, but on a deeper level, understand each other and understand, and truly empathize with each other, because we have, we've walked a similar path. I think, on a, this sort of conversation about Ramadan is really interesting to me, because it helps us understand, how this has impacted our faith communities in different ways. So we have a shared suffering, but we also have different suffering. And in the sense that, it's in, the shapes of our lives are different in each of our communities. And so, I think one of the things that, that we can do, and I think we need to be doing, especially as people of faith or religious leaders, is trying to understand, how this has impacted us differently, in terms of, the shape of our worship, in terms of, the shape of our holidays, and those sorts of things. Because I think, those, it's kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of this, understanding how we're different, I think in a profound way helps us to, understand on a deeper level who we are, as well as who the person across the table from us is. And so, I think this moment that, this moment that is going to be a defining feature for the rest of our lives, I think, sort of provides that window into understanding, both what we share and what we don't share.
I think for me, I agree with everything Travis said. The universality of the suffering definitely, I think, is something that, for me, I've never quite experienced it, in my lifetime, the way that I'm sort of experiencing it now. And I think that's just really kind of profound realization. I think specifically sort of the role of religion or religious actors in this crisis, I think has been, it's been something that's been a part of the national conversation, but also it sort of reminds us again of what each tradition is about, right? And so, especially with the prior, more politicized discourse around, and to some extent, of course, still ongoing politicized discourse around religion we tend to kind of get into this mode where we're thinking about religion, especially other people's religion, in very sort of political terms. But now with the sort of highlighting of the service and the sort of, again, the filling of the spiritual void that so many religious entities are playing, I think that really kind of has brought out the religion part of religions. And I think even in this, I've done a couple of talks on these various sort of lawsuits where, challenging shutdown orders and they're impacting houses of worship. And I think among the range of the lawsuits and the challenges, I mean, not all are the same, right? Some of them I think are problematic, whereas others I think are actually raising viable, really important issues. And I think for the latter set of cases, I think one of the things that they're pointing to is that in some cases, government authorities, not necessarily in any sort of intentional way or malicious way, aren't fully understanding the importance of religion to people's lives, right? Even the terminology that's used, essential businesses. In one case, the term was life-sustaining businesses can stay open, non-life sustaining can't, right? They have to be closed. And so this sort of, it seems like these lawsuits are trying to explain and get at, and of course it's done in the context of free exercise and sometimes RFRA language that, there's a reason religion gets these really great protections. It's because it serves this really vital role. And sometimes often government entities don't get it. And so it's the role of the citizen to be able to bring these challenges and say, look, this is really important to us. And so I think that, I don't know how much of that conversation has, kind of come to the fore in light of all the sort of politicized other discourse around it. But I think for me, that has been one of the eye-opening aspects of this whole crisis, particularly when I see people's response to it. And so it's interesting for me because not just in the Christian community, the way certain Christians are responding to these church challenges, but also when I put up, for Eid, I put up an article about what certain mosques did to accommodate, Muslims on Eid, whether it be this one mosque who that basically had people drive up and they would just prayed next to their cars and like more than 6 feet apart. And other cases, there were a number of mosques that did these drive-through Eid celebrations. And there was an article I read about an IKEA in Germany that sort of provided its massive parking lot to this. Hundreds of people came to pray, and they were all separated by 6 feet. And if you see the image of it, it's actually really cool. And there was another case where there was this mosque in Syracuse that, essentially one of the congregants there is this asbestos abatement expert who decided he was going to create what they call a clean room by covering the entire thing in plastic and disinfecting it in a very precise way. And even sort of the way that he managed the in and outflow of the air in the room, went to such great lengths, he said, to respond to the needs of the local community, which included a number of refugees, for whom, when they're in a moment of crisis, their first instinct is to go to the mosque more, not less. And to me, like all of these different things, like just really kind of, for me, was a reflection of the profound importance of religion. And it was always interesting and sort of surprising for me when I saw even people within the Muslim community respond to these, like, why are they doing this? Like, what is the purpose of this? Such a waste of resources. Why can't people just stay home? And I'm like, it's like as if they don't understand that people's experience of religion and people have diverse needs. And not everyone sees this and comes at this in the same way. And so I remember this being just a clarifying point for me, just as to how there's these divisions, even within religious communities, about the way they see religion, and how, and just sort of the different conceptions and experiences of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you guys tell me more about how you move past that point of seeing other people's religion as a political issue and value people and their experiences, and that, Asma, you were saying the vital importance of religion in people's lives?
I think for me, it's like, I guess, when I was my prior answer, kind of giving examples from both the Christian and Muslim context. I think for me, that kind of just shows like that connection between people within the respective religious communities, and how, whether it be houses of worship, just like the presence of a house of worship, like in your religious practice and your religious experience, how that is shared, it seems like, across these different subsets of people across religious communities, even if there's a difference of opinion within the religious community. I think that was, for me, just an interesting multi-faith component of this.
Yeah, to sort of talk about this, religious liberty, or I don't know exactly how you want to characterize kind of these flashpoints in terms of reopening and restrictions and that kind of thing. But it's interesting, Asma. I've also sort of noticed that this has been a dynamic, largely within the Christian community, but not just Protestants, but Catholics as well, and within the Jewish community. But I haven't seen much in terms of I haven't seen much. I mean, really, even protest coming from the Muslim community. I was talking with a mutual friend of ours a couple of weeks ago about this, and his take was that perhaps one of the things that's driving this is just an impulse to sort of stay under the radar and not pop up in a time like this. I'm curious if you have any reflections on why that is that. Why that is that there haven't been more protests, because I'll say I don't think I think the overall story of what's happened with respect to COVID restrictions and communities of faith has been really positive. I mean, I think in most places, you think about how many cities, how many counties there are, across the country. There have been some cases where government officials have said alarming and foolish things. But when you think about how many government officials there are, in some ways it's really remarkable and surprising that there haven't been more instances of this conflict. And I say that with sort of the caveat that we're on the front end of this. I think we will see more conflict, as we move forward. But so I say that as a way to say, I think there have been legitimate issues where where government officials seem to have targeted communities of faith in ways that at least from my standpoint are objectionable, even if they are the exception to the rule rather than the norm. But I'm curious why I'm curious if you have any thoughts, Asma, why it is that the Muslim community hasn't raised their voices about this.
Well, I mean, I think that what our mutual friend said about wanting to fly under the radar is probably right. I think there was actually one mosque. I saw something on Twitter where they actually put out a notice essentially saying that we're not going to challenge these shutdown orders because it's just going to make us the target of increased Islamophobic acts. And I think that tendency to sort of tiptoe around things and to not assert our rights in as sort of vigorous fashion as other religious communities do. I mean, in many ways, that was sort of the subject of my book, right? Like, we can have these rights, but some groups just don't feel as comfortable using them, whether it be because they don't feel like they're going to win, or because or because they are afraid of public backlash. And when you already have a community that's so used to being beat up, it tries to stay out of the public eye in any sort of negative way as much as possible. And so I think that's a huge driver here. I think, in terms of, I wonder, and I'm sort of just speculating here, but I think also just the role of religious houses of worship and also the flexibility. One thing, Alyssa, you had asked earlier was, what's sort of unique about our respective responses. And what I thought was interesting was, like, from the very beginning, there was, various scholars who are talking about the flexibility that's inherent in Islamic law, where it says, yeah, this is what's usually required, but in moments of duress like this, it's not required, right? So there's a realization, sort of the practical elements of the world that will change the rules. And so I think it's just been kind of like an understanding of like the sort of inherent sort of, pragmatism of Islam in that respect. And sort of drawing on those things. And again, I think it's also a function of time. If this were to extend, I mean, I remember I mean, by some predictions, this is going to go into 2022. So I don't know, and I think the complexities are just going to become, greater as we move forward, as there's like this phased reopening. And then it's just like, well, which businesses or venues are allowed to open first versus second? How much is the question of what's being allowed to be open tied to the science versus tied to other sorts of judgments? I think those complexities will possibly change the picture. But I think it's kind of early, and for the early stages, I think most Muslims are comfortable kind of, running with the inherent sort of flexibility of our faith to be able to do things a different way.
I just to add one thing to that. I mean, I would say as a Baptist, somebody who really, I really believe in religious freedom, not just for my community, but for all communities, because I think it, not only is it, in line with our constitutional principles, but I also just believe theologically that this is God's pattern for how government ought to be ordered. And so I think there, as we were talking earlier about understanding, both the sort of similarities and differences between our communities, I think it's, these moments, it's important for us to have these conversations because, for me, as a religious liberty advocate, I find it to be personally painful to hear, another community say, well, it is impacting us, but we just don't feel like we can assert the rights that we have because, it will be too costly for us. I think in some ways it's incumbent upon, those of us who do have the ability to, to raise our voices, at least we think we do, without that kind of backlash, to speak up, not for ourselves only, but also for others who are being similarly impacted.
Yeah, I think what I think makes that even more possible, it seems, is the fact, going back to this idea that it's really kind of the religion part of religion, as opposed to sort of the politicized stuff, right? The stuff, and I think the houses of worship and just like worship in general, like I think that there's it's a pretty easy thing for people to understand, right? That this is a part of being a religious believer, as opposed to some of the other, more political manifestations of religious practice. And so, yeah, I think that because it is a pretty black and white instance of a religious liberty problem, one thing, something that's depoliticized. That said, of course, the debate over these lawsuits and the validity of these challenges has become politicized, right?
Right.
So I have seen some, prominent speakers from the left essentially saying that any type of shutdown order that makes exceptions for religion, for houses of worship. I don't know how precisely they cut this, but the idea was that for I don't know if they're comparing precise sort of levels of risk and saying that, you shouldn't make a distinction for houses of worship in any way that's different from other places with similar levels of risk. More what I've seen is like, to the extent the shutdown orders make an exception for churches as essential businesses, that in itself is discriminatory and, places vulnerable people at risk. And so it kind of goes back to that language that we're used to hearing, which is religious actors hurting vulnerable people.
Right.
And it was interesting for me because it didn't seem like it was translating very cleanly. And so it was interesting to see that same language come up. And when I say it's not translating very, obviously it's just the whole concept of third party harm, right? Like when these more politicized cases, it's like, well, you're stopping the female employee from getting her contraception, or you're stopping the gay couple from getting the cake. And so there's like this relatively more obvious or third party harm. But in the case of churches, it's really like, well, to the extent that it's impacting largely the people who are attending and their families who are probably voluntary participants in this, that gets kind of complicated. And so it's interesting to see that same language pop up.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how things get politicized so quickly, and then you lose the personal impact that all these issues have on people. and part of our series, our Food for Thought series, is we're talking about how we create a more inclusive, compassionate society where politics do serve people and they benefit human lives. So how, and part of this question is in reaction to the state of the conversation on race in America that's been aggravated by the case of George Floyd. And so I'm wondering, from each of your perspectives, how do we create a more compassionate, inclusive society? And what role does vulnerability play in that? And what does that look like for each of you personally?
Well, vulnerability is my word. The project that I have, that Christy is a part of at the Asma Institute, is called The Politics of Vulnerability. And so, I think that there's it came from a place where I was like, so much of this is just about groups and their sort of competing claims to vulnerability. And, I think that there's space for everyone to be vulnerable, for everyone to have their grievances and for everyone to be able to fight for their rights. And there doesn't need to be this competitive element, but the politics part of it, right? That's what creates this sort of competitive element. So it's kind of like, well, only one of us can really be suffering. And so, and by virtue of my suffering like that, I have to sort of, the way that sort of manifests is essentially in a way that's hostile to other people's suffering. And that's the part of it that I'm really trying to tackle, that there's so much power in vulnerability. And there's so much conversation, honestly, right now in our popular discourse about the power of vulnerability. But if you don't harness that power, then essentially it can be weaponized for more hostile ends.
I think what I would sort of add to that is, we've sort of talked at a couple points in this conversation about how, early on there was, kind of this détente from the trajectory of polarization and politicization that our country's been dealing with for the last several years. And I think Asma was saying earlier, it was just interesting to see how long that was going to last. Well, it certainly is over now. We're now have reverted back to those patterns. I think some of it is that we're in an election year, and political actors have a lot to gain and lose in election years, and so they're it creates its own set of incentives to say things a certain way and to try to inject certain narratives into the conversation. I would just say, I think we sort of have to get out of our head the idea that we're getting back to normal. The world is going to be really different on the other side of this, and different in some ways that we can predict, and in some ways that we aren't going to be able to predict, and we're not going to be able to see them until we're living them. And so, I think to the extent that we were already dealing with a very complex set of problems in terms of both politicization, as well as racial injustice, and the sort of racialization, I think, as some of these issues that we've been talking about. These are complicated problems in and of themselves, and I think trying to solve them in a world that we don't know exactly what it's going to look like on the other side of this. It won't be what we had before; it'll be something new. I think makes it even more difficult to try to build strategies now. So I feel like I'm like on path to sort of end on a low note. So maybe Asma can rescue us here, but I mean, I think we do need to grapple seriously with the challenges that are ahead of us, because these the polarization plainly has not gone away. I don't know exactly when this is going to be released, but at the time that we're recording this, we're in day 2 of serious riots and violence in Minneapolis, and at least as of this afternoon, there's no end in sight. And so this is the reality of the world that we're living in, and in order for us to to try to build a future that deals with these forces that are pulling us apart, I think we have to recognize that it's going to be harder than it was before. In part, just because we just don't know, what what things are going to look like. I'll sort of say this last little point, and then I'd be interested in Asma's reflections on this. I mean, I think one of the challenges of these, that these problems present to us is that at least my conviction is I don't think that there is one silver bullet or one strategy that we can employ. It's sort of we have to do a lot of interconnected things, each of which are hard. All at the same time in order to get to the other side of this. And that has to do with changing our information ecosystems. It has to do with changing our relationships. Most of us have relationships with people who are really a lot like us and look like us and believe a lot of the same things. We don't have a lot of difference in terms of our relationships, and those are depolarizing forces in our lives. These relationships that we have. It's the way that we look at politics. It's the way that we talk about politics. It's the way that our political actors are behaving. So, and again, each of these things are not easy to solve in and of themselves. And I sort of think we need to make progress on all of them in order to make a dent in the overall picture. But I think if there is any. I think if there is any silver lining, to this, it's that, this moment that we're all sort of living in terms of the coronavirus is, I think has reminded all of us in a profound way of our shared humanity, in part because of the shared suffering that we're experiencing together. Whether that is going to be a strong enough force to allow us to make the difficult changes that we need to make, both in our lives and in our communities, in order to impact our larger culture as a nation, I think, remains to be seen. But, I do think there are some interesting ingredients that we can use in these moments that we're living in right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I agree that there's just parts of, especially with these riots, that I was just feeling so hopeless. Like I was like, oh my God, it's not even just the way it was before, but it's almost like that to me, it's almost like a symbol of just how things have gotten worse, right? There's like already
right, because it happens so fast.
Yeah, and it's whether it be the murder itself, and then the rioting, the fires, but then all of a sudden this like video footage that I saw on the news today about the looting that's happening, and it's like police can't even interfere; they're afraid to like intervene, and it was just like the elements of like people who are probably looting for things that they need because of the nature of like our world right now with the pandemic and their economic needs. And it was just like, this is just so many layers of despair and misery. And I was already kind of feeling that on an international level before, when I was kind of looking at the suffering of people who are already going through so much prior to the pandemic. Whether it be the Rohingya and like what their plight in the face of this. My father-in-law was actually on a trip to India, and he was supposed to travel back right when the borders got closed. So he's kind of stuck in India. And so he's kind of telling me about just like, and not to mention, and everything I'm sort of reading and seeing about what's going on there. And just sort of the extreme levels of sort of poverty and despair that people are experiencing. To me, it was like, just when you think that maybe there's an opening for the world to move forward, it just seems like we've just been set back, like 10 steps back. So there is that feeling. But, I think that out of this sort of despair comes possibilities for change, and a lot of people I think today are talking about, there's going to be a new normal. It's not going to be the normal that we knew. And in some ways that might be a good thing, because there are a lot of problems with that. And maybe if we're pushed in these ways, we'll be forced to do the things that we just didn't have the time or the motivation to do before. And so to that end, I mean, specifically connecting that to multi-faith communities, we've been talking a lot about the sort of contributions of religious entities and the service that so many, religious groups sort of provide for their local and broader societies. I think, I wonder if that isn't a moment for religion. So much of this is about what is religion, what is the positive of religion, what's the point of religious freedom, is religion a good for society? Like maybe this is a time for religious communities to really kind of make that clear, and also to start detaching themselves from the way that politics and politicians choose to sort of appropriate them with their message. And so, I mean, that's kind of a broad abstract idea. I think it sort of depends on where religious communities go with this. Ultimately, I'm still hopeful that, in the face of all the suffering, there is going to be an increased capacity for empathy. I think if there's anything that's been made clear to us is like our sort of mortality, which I think is a huge part of this, by the way, just sort of like the presence of death, and just like how that changes people and makes them realize that there is a bigger purpose here.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're both so right. There's just so much pain that is underneath the surface and layers to it. And there's a lot to dig into that we have to talk about if we're going to try to make any changes in society. We're running out of time here, so this is actually going to be our last question. But just for our listeners who are possibly feeling overwhelmed with everything that's going on, like you said, Travis, these questions are really complicated, and moving into the unknown future just adds another layer of difficulty onto it. So what is something that has helped you to learn to be more empathetic for people who don't share your point of view, and that can encourage other people who are stepping into these conversations and into these spaces in our unknown future?
I can jump in. I mean, one of the things that has encouraged me during this time, in terms of producing empathy, in terms of how this pandemic is impacting communities that are not like mine. In some ways Ramadan has kind of been, kind of one of those aha moments for me in, thinking about how this has impacted my friends. My mother-in-law and her husband are actually in the middle of moving to Dubai right now, and it's been put on hold. But as a result of that, they're working with the people in their company are all Muslims, and that's generated a lot of conversation about how this has impacted us, how it's impacted them, and so I think I feel like we've made this point a couple of times, but there is just something really profound in learning about somebody else's, how the same thing has impacted somebody in a really different way, in a way that you weren't expecting, or a way that you hadn't even thought about before. I think it's sort of that I don't know if you could sort of describe it as just like a burst of empathy that you feel, that I think helps draw us together as human beings. And so I think the more that we can have those moments with each other across communities, I think that's going to produce the kinds of resources that we're really going to need on the other side of this, to stick up for each other, and to really to love one another, as we try to build a better future together.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think for me, I was sort of reading some of the facts of these different cases that have been brought. And there was this one case, I think it was, I don't remember, but it was one of the ones that DOJ got involved in. And it was talking about like this church that had this drive-in service. And it was because they were sort of broadcasting over this sort of low FM channel. And they were explaining to the court that the people who come to this church, like you can't sort of assume that everybody has access to like Zoom, right? Or to like the internet. And so it's just like, that to me was like, whoa, I didn't even think about that. Like, it was just, I mean,
Right.
I realized that, of course, even in the context of kids being at a public school, there's been so much that we've been hearing about, like, getting certain kids the resources that other kids have, and making sure everyone can participate in online learning. But I think in the context of religious worship, it sort of had it occur to me. And that to me was like, that kind of just shows like there was like these very sort of specific needs and vulnerabilities that certain parts of our religious communities have. And that there's a need to sort of, another version of this is like, for example, the mosque that I talked about, where the person covered it all in plastic and it went to this extraordinary lengths to be able to make the mosque something where people can come in safely. And he cited the fears of these refugees. And it's just different people have a different way of grappling with this. And religion plays a different role for them. It's accessible to them in different degrees as compared to the rest of us. And I think that to me was sort of one of the sort of the big realizations I had.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much. Thank you for coming here and for giving us your time today and being a part of this conversation. I've so enjoyed hearing each of your perspectives on faith and politics and the importance of religion in society and protecting religious freedoms. Yeah, these are really powerful reminders that other people's experiences are valuable and important and deserve to be protected. Yeah, so I just thank you both so much.
Thank you.
No, it's great to be with you.
Yeah. All right. Have a good day. In a world that threatens to divide people based on their differences, this conversation reminds me that we often have more in common with others when we listen to their stories. There are joys and pains shared in faith communities around the world, and I want to thank Asma and Travis for the encouragement to see the both and of holding your own beliefs while respecting others. While the future ahead is uncertain and complicated, there is room at the table for everyone's story. Thanks for listening in.
For more of the Empathy Table, head to the Ideos YouTube account or website and stream audio from any podcast app. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review, like, subscribe, and share. Follow Ideos on social media to stay up to date with new episodes. Thank you for sharing our table today. We hope you'll tune in next week for another feast of story, hope, and empathy.